Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for coming. For those of you who are on Zoom, thanks for coming as well. We're going to be starting very soon right now. Just want to lay out a little bit about what you should expect. Our presenter, Richard Becker, will be speaking for approximately half an hour. And then after that, there'll be Q&A and comments, I suppose, as well. On your chairs, you should have a card. So write down any questions that occur to you or comments that occur to you during his presentation or after. And Robin Larson is going to be the person who's going to be collecting the cards and also reading the questions. For those of you who are on Zoom, of course, you can put your questions in the chat and we'll forward those to Robin as well. So at this point, I want to introduce Willard, who's going to give us the Ohlone recognition. Okay.
Good morning. I'm here to make the land acknowledgement. We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that our community is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone tribes, the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working here, and we affirm their sovereign rights as First People. So this is an acknowledgement that you hear over and over again. It's important that we do that. But I also want to remind folks that there's a thriving American Indian community here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So please, connect with all the cultural resources that you have. And what's really exciting is that, we are now understanding the history of Native people in the Bay Area. But we have storytellers, artists, journalists, Native American people who are telling their own stories. So happy American Indian Heritage Month, which is in November. And to learn more, please go to various resources at the public library. There's a series of lectures. And you could also go on the internet, look at kqed.org, our San Francisco public television. There are numerous programs for Native American Heritage Month, telling the stories, again, written by Native people, about the struggles, but the triumphs of Native people today.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dolores Perez Heilbrunn, and I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. We welcome back to the Unitarian Universalist Society a longtime friend for many years, Richard Becker. His organization has been a leading group for many anti-war demonstrations since the 1960s against war that our country has been involved in, including the wars in Central America, the Iraq War, and now this new conflict in the Middle East. He is the Western Regional Coordinator of the ANSWER Coalition, and ANSWER stands for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. Let's just think about those words. Act now to stop war and end racism. That is why we asked Richard to come today. Richard has traveled to Palestine and the Middle East during the past 50 years and is the author of many articles on this subject and is the author of the book called Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire. A brand new edition of this book will be due out December 1st. Richard is a frequent contributor to Liberation News, the website of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Welcome, Richard. We're so glad you're here today.
Thank you very much, Dolores, and thanks again for the invitation to be here today and to speak to you all. And I hope that we have a lot of time for discussion. So I want to ask Bruce if he'll, after I've spoken for about 30 minutes, just give me a signal and I'll wrap up and we can go on to discussion. I think that have any of you been to the demonstrations, the protests that have been taking place? Great. That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's I think been a shock to the establishment and to the mainstream media the kind of response, given the demonization of the Palestinians, what kind of response there's been. Hundreds of thousands of people, maybe more, have demonstrated across the country. You know, just Friday night, Friday in Nashville, Tennessee, there were 1,500 people who marched. There are demonstrations everywhere. I mean, I mentioned that one because I got a phone call about it. But all over the country, this is taking place. And I think it shows that there's been a kind of sea change in the attitude of a large part of the public toward the Palestinian issue, which has been such a demonized issue for so long. So I want to start by asking a question, and that is, why isn't a highly paid pilot of a high-tech warplane who drops 1,000-pound bombs on a densely packed and defenseless, really defenseless refugee camp, why isn't that person called a terrorist? You know, and I say this, I say this because the vocabulary is very important. Words are important, and words are the shaping of the public narrative, the public discourse is very much influenced by the way words are used or not used. So, for instance, if you watch CNN or Fox, I don't watch Fox, but sometimes I watch CNN until I can't stand it anymore, and you know, which is usually about 10 minutes. And the word brutal is never attached to anything Israel has done. Brutal is reserved for what Palestinians do. Palestinians are denied the right of retaliation in the media here. They can never retaliate. You know, it's the Israelis are always retaliating. And if you really listen to the way it's described, that is true. And what that means, of course, is that the retaliators were done harm before, and that they are the victims, and the other side are the victimizers. And this is very true about and you know, when you think about the retaliation, the word retaliation, and the way that it's used in regard to this conflict, this struggle that's going on, is that it has a great deal to do with what date you start history at. So if history begins on October 7th, and then what's said after, and the attack that took place from Gaza into Israel, you know, then that's the presentation. That's when history started. It was on October 7th. And so whatever happens after that is then justified because it's retaliation. And it leaves out, and often the word unprovoked is attached to the attack that took place on October 7th. And I don't think people talk about this too much, but I want to a little bit, because the unprovoked is another word, and it's used over and over and over again. It's still, you can turn on the media today and it'll say the unprovoked attack that took place. But Israel is an apartheid system. It's an apartheid system. You know, the B'Tselem, which is an Israeli institution, human rights institution, Palestinian human rights institutions, and Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, have all written detailed reports showing that Israel is an apartheid system. Isn't forcing people to live under apartheid provocation? I mean, I would say it is. And so you have this, and what's going on today in the West Bank. The prime minister, not the prime minister, the minister of national security is called Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a fascist. I'm not using the word lightly or hyperbolic. He was a follower of Meir Kahane, who some people here will remember, and had a picture in his living room until 2019 of Baruch Goldstein, who carried out a massacre in the Ibrahim Mosque in Hebron, killing 29 Palestinians and wounding 125 back in I believe it was 1995. And he only took down the picture because they told him, if you want to run for office, you can't have that picture in your living room. And he said, oh, okay, I'll take it down. He's the national security minister. He has now, with the support and with the rifles, 10,000 assault rifles, he's distributed them to the settler youth and other settlers. These formed these so-called citizen security administration, and they are now engaged in a mini al-Nakba of driving out. They've driven out 15 Palestinian villages as of yesterday, driven out the population altogether, small villages, and the settlers carry out these attacks. They're rampaging through the West Bank, but somehow this isn't provocation. Somehow this is left out of the U.S. media altogether. So saying that, I think it's just, I say it so that we think about that we all think about the vocabulary of what is presented to us. And today there are more than 7,000 Palestinians held in Israeli prisons, political prisoners. They're all held illegally. They're held, more than 1,500 of them are under administrative detention, meaning no charges, no attorney, no family visits, for 6 months, renewable indefinitely. But all the prisoners are held illegally because transferring people from an occupied area under international law inside the occupying power is a violation of international law. All those prisoners are held illegally. And something about that should be said is, what does that make them? I would say that makes them hostages. To be held illegally without charge, but of course, that can't be said either in the mainstream media. But I think more and more people understand something about this. And so why does the capitalist media, the corporate media, engage in this deception all the time? CNN, Fox, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera, are really the mouthpieces of the U.S. and the Israeli regimes, especially in times of war. They too are guilty of war crimes and genocide. Was Joseph Goebbels guilty of war crimes and genocide? Yes, he was. He was the propagandist. It's not just those who pull a trigger or fire the guns and so forth. It's those who really make this accessible or understandable to the public in the way they want the public to understand. And this is one of the many issues that's addressed in the book, which was published first in 2009, that I wrote and which a number of other people worked on, called Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire. And the new version, as Dolores said, is about to come out. And we produced this book in order to try to give a clear explanation of what the history is, how the present situation came about, and to demolish the myths that have occupied the airwaves and the minds of so many people in this country. It's really a book written for activists and to be a resource book for activists. And as much as possible, we have quoted the leaders of the Zionist movement, the movement that founded the state of Israel, about their intent not only to settle, but to drive out the indigenous Palestinian population and to steal as well for their own use homes, farms, and other resources, workshops. And many people still live in homes that were Palestinian homes. And that which the new Israeli government did not want, it destroyed. 536 villages were burned and bulldozed in Palestine. There's a unique character, and I want to talk a little bit about the history, going back to the beginning of the Zionist movement. The first World Zionist Congress took place in a Jewish state, and they talked about Uganda, and the British recommended Uganda. There was also a discussion about Argentina, and of course Palestine, and that's what was settled on by the movement. All of those were parts of empires or dependencies of empires at that time. And none of them, the idea, those who were talking about the idea didn't really have any thought to what the people of those areas would think about that. And that's because Zionism was a very strange form of colonialism. And what made it strange was that it was a reaction on the one hand to the very real anti-Semitism, particularly in Eastern Europe, but actually triggered the first Congress, and Theodore Herzl was moved by the trial of a French military officer who was convicted, Dreyfus, on the basis of anti-Semitism. So it was on the one hand a very real reaction to anti-Semitism, but on the other hand, it was like all other European colonial movements, a movement that had no regard for the rights of indigenous people. And the other thing that made it very unusual was that it didn't have an army or a navy. All the other colonial powers did. You can't go up to people and say, hey, we're here to take over your land, okay? They will not accept that. It can only be done by force. It can only be done by violence against those people. And so you have this, they are in need of a sponsor. The Zionist movement had to find a sponsor. It had to find the army and navy that could do for it what it could not do for itself. And they pursued the Russian Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, the French Empire, and finally the British Empire. And they settled on trying to, and they had to come up with, of course, some quid pro quo, right? Like, okay, so we're empires. You can't go to them and say, we are oppressed people. Can you help us? No, they're empires. That's their business, is oppressing people. They have to come up with something. So here's what Chaim Weizmann, who followed Herzl as the central leader. Herzl died in 1904. This is 1914, on the eve of World War I. And he writes a letter to the British government, Weizmann, and said, should Palestine fall within the British sphere of influence, and should Britain encourage Jewish settlement, we could develop the country, bring back civilization to it, and form a very effective guard for the Suez Canal. Well, I don't think the British were that impressed by the offer about the Suez Canal. I mean, they still didn't have an army, so how are they going to and the British had a very big army and the biggest navy in the world. But so why did they do it? Why did they support this? And one of the very interesting people involved in this whole process was the famous, but it should be infamous, Winston Churchill. Racist, imperialist. There's many things you could say about, but I'll read a little bit about what he wrote. And he was central to the process. He was in the small meetings where the Balfour Declaration came out, and so forth. And he said, let me see here. From the days of Spartacus to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky in Russia, Bela Kun, Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg, this is a letter to a newspaper, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, and Emma Goldman in the United States, the worldwide conspiracy to overthrow civilization. I mean, you're getting this? These are all Jewish people he's talking about. Apparently, going back to Spartacus, Churchill thought all bad things that have happened would be, I mean, he is the ultimate anti-Semite, because he had power. And he said, there's no need to exaggerate the part played in the creation of Bolshevism and the actual bringing about of the Russian Revolution by these international and, for the most part, atheistical Jews, blah, blah, blah. And he goes on. And he says, Zionism offers the third sphere to the political conceptions of the Jewish race, the violent contrast to international communism, et cetera, et cetera. So this is his idea. His idea why to support this, because most of the politically active Jewish population in Europe at this time is not for any of this. I mean, totally opposed. Consider that it will do great harm to Jewish people to adopt this kind of an idea. And so you have Churchill saying, well, this can be a way to, and Churchill, by the way, was also the manager of the international effort to overthrow the Russian Revolution, the 14 different imperialist countries that joined together and so forth. But he was the coordinator of it. So he's very much thinking along these lines, that this is a reactionary ideology that can be useful to us. Of course, as time went on, when in 1917 there was the Balfour Declaration, where the British say they'll support the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. What's very interesting about that is the British didn't control Palestine at that time. It was still part of the Ottoman Empire. They hadn't taken over, but they were taking over, and they knew what they were planning. And they thought, well, this can be another outpost for us in the empire upon which the sun never set, they said at the time. So, about the colonizers, it's the Zionist colonizers from Europe were not different than the other colonizers, as I said, in terms of their approach. I don't know if people know what the doctrine of discovery is. So the doctrine that was just renounced by the Catholic Church. It hasn't been renounced yet by the U.S. Supreme Court. It hasn't. Seriously, in 2005, in the case of the Oneida Nation of Indians against the city of Sherrill, New York, the Oneida Indians were trying to get back some of their land that had been guaranteed to them by treaty. It was turned down by the Supreme Court, and the person who wrote the decision was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she invoked the doctrine of discovery from the 1400s, and the doctrine of discovery said originally that any land that wasn't owned by Christians, when the Christians got there, it belonged to them. I mean, and that later turned into white, from Christian to white. Any land that wasn't occupied already by Europeans that could be taken over. So that's the reality of what all the European settlers look like. And we should pay careful attention to the words that were spoken about 2 weeks ago, when Netanyahu, who's a war criminal of the highest rank or lowest rank, whatever, he said that what's going on now is Israel's second war of independence, national war of independence. And we should remember what the first national war of independence was. It was al-Nakba. It was the catastrophe. It was the driving out of 750,000 people. And they were driven out to make way for the Zionist state, which from all of its leaders, Jabotinsky as well as Ben-Gurion, as the leaders of the two main currents of Zionism, believed, which is they could not coexist. That the Arab population, the Palestinian population, had to be removed by means of transfer. And today you hear them talking about transfer again. They've avoided that word for a long time, but they're talking about it again. And this is for decades after, and I grew up believing this too, for decades after the creation of the State of Israel, the main idea that they produced and propagated was that the Palestinians left voluntarily. Some kings told them to leave, so they left. You have to think about how ridiculous that is. This is a nation of peasant farmers. You can't tell farmers, oh, leave the farm. Or, you can come back in a few months or sometime and everything will be okay. No, it won't be okay. The farm will be gone. It's destroyed. It could only have been accomplished by means of terror. And the terror came about. There was really the war began with the UN resolution, the anniversary of which is coming up, November 29th, 1947. The war started. The Zionist side was much better armed, much well funded. The Palestinians' rebellion in 1936 to 39, which we have a book about in the back, that had been crushed, and the Palestinians were in a very weakened state, relatively speaking. And but the first stages of the war didn't work from the point of view of the Zionist leaders, of Ben-Gurion and others, because there'd be a battle and the Palestinians would just move from one village to another to escape the battle. They probably had relatives nearby, and then they would come back. And this wasn't accomplishing what was, from the Zionist leaders' point of view, the Israeli leaders, this wasn't accomplishing what they needed. So they came up with a new plan called Plan Dalet, and it was put into effect first dramatically at Deir Yassin, a village on the outskirts of Jerusalem, on April 9th of 1948, when the population was slaughtered. And it became very famous. It became known in the world. The media was actually there, some international media, but it didn't stop. It went on, and Ilan Pappé, a well-known Israeli historian, has documented in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, what he says is up to 200 massacres that were carried out. And typically now, instead of battles happening, the population, the non-combatant population retreating to the next village, now the population was being rounded up in the villages. Men and boys who were deemed of fighting age were frequently shot, and the survivors were put in trucks and driven to the nearest border and forced out at gunpoint. And this happened on a mass scale. And after it happens for a little while, you don't have to tell people anymore. You don't have to drive them. They'll go themselves before the death squads, as they were, arrive at their village. Then the terror was carried out mainly by rifles and bayonets and explosives. And today it's carried out mainly by high-tech warplanes. And it's clear that the Israeli regime now intends to drive out as much of the Palestinian population as possible. That was the meaning, of course, of ordering more than 1.5 million people from the northern part of Gaza to the southern part. The intention, and it's not a done deal because this is still going on, but the intention definitely is not to return. From the Israeli point of view, is to not return that territory. And in fact, the documents have been reported in numerous sources that what their intention is to try to drive the entire Gazan population across the border into the Sinai. In 1967 was the war that brought the West Bank and Gaza, Golan Heights, Sinai Peninsula, which went back to Egypt, East Jerusalem, under Israeli control. And that war, again, is presented, I heard in the National Public Radio saying, oh, that war where the Israelis reacted to the attack by Egypt and Syria. No, that's not what happened. And we document in our book from the mouths of the people who conducted the war that that's not what happened. What happened was that they decided, Menachem Begin, who would become prime minister, said 10 years later, let's not make a mistake. It wasn't him. We went after him. He meant Nasser at that time. As a matter of fact, let me just read his exact words and the words of "We must be honest with ourselves," says Begin to the Israeli National Defense College in 1982, 15 years later. "We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him," meaning Nasser. And 10 years earlier, Mattiyahu Peled, people might hear Miko Peled occasionally being interviewed these days, his son, who's turned against the Zionist enterprise. He said the thesis, he was one of the top commanders in 67. He said the thesis that the danger of genocide was hanging over us in June 1967, and then Israel was fighting for its physical existence, is only a bluff, which was born and developed after the war. And Moshe Dayan, who was the so-called defense minister at that time, said 20 years later, we would send a tractor to plow some area in the demilitarized zone and knew in advance that the Syrians would start to shoot. If they didn't shoot, we tell the tractor to advance further, until in the end, the Syrians would get annoyed and shoot. And then we'd use artillery and later the Air Force also. And that's how it was. So this is the reality. You know, this is again, the reality that has been so distorted here. And the 1967 war is very important from the point of view of U.S.-Israel relations, because it changed the relationship. It changed the relationship that up until then, there was U.S. support, U.S. aid. The U.S. wasn't that happy with the state of Israel, especially in its early days when it was more, you know, I said that it had to find a sponsor, it had to find a country to support it. After the war in 1948, that country was France. And France helped Israel develop an atomic bomb at the Dimona nuclear site there. But now with the 67 war, we have this comment by Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford was then the House Republican minority leader, later to be president. And he said, Israel, while the war was still raging, he said, Israel has done a pretty good job of bailing out U.S. interests in the area. So what's he talking about? He's talking about at a time of rising radicalism in the Middle East. Syria was being called the Cuba of the Middle East at that time in U.S. government circles and in the media. So the surprise attack and destruction of much of Syrian and Egyptian military was greatly appreciated by the U.S. And it's at that time that the aid from the U.S. to Israel goes from the millions and hundreds of millions to the billions. And in 60, I believe it's in 69, they got like something like 4 billion, which in present money would be 32 billion or something like that. And then came the Nixon Doctrine. And this is where Israel really becomes a key element in the U.S. imperial scheme. So the Nixon Doctrine, which was implemented after Nixon came in 69, said that the Middle East should have two kind of pivot guards. One should be Iran, where the U.S. had overthrown the government 16 years earlier and where this horrific regime existed of the Shah, and the other should be Israel. And they should, between the two of them, they'd get a lot of money. Israel would get a lot more, but they'd get a lot of money and a lot of support, modern weaponry, and all of that in order to protect U.S. interests in the region. And why did they need this? Well, the U.S. was a little bit tied down somewhere else at the time. In Vietnam, there were 500,000 U.S. troops there. They were losing the war, and they needed something. So this is why, and this is there's a lot more things that we could talk about, but I just want to close by saying this: is that why does the U.S. do it? Why do we have this situation? Why is the mainstream media so incredibly one-sided, and the government, and I mean, to the extent of great absurdity? Like a few weeks ago, the House of Representatives passed by 412 to 9 a resolution that said Israel is not an apartheid state. I mean, maybe they can start voting on other things like the sun does not rise, it would be just as logical. I mean, here you have all of this. So is it really because of shared values? I mean, what are those shared? Maybe if you look back in colonialism and you could find some shared value there, but that's not what they're talking about. I mean, these are both supposed to be democratic states. In reality today, the population in what was mandatory Palestine, British mandate, British colony of Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, and the 1948 Israel, the population is about equal between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis. It's almost exactly, the Palestinian population is probably a little bit bigger. But you have the apartheid system is different in different areas. There was Gaza, which was completely fenced in. really have to think about what's going to happen if you fence people in for 17 years and you destroy their lives. What's going to happen? And then in the West Bank, there's two completely different systems for the Jewish settlers and for the Palestinians. There's different roads. We talk about this in the book too, about some of the different details about this. There's a different legal system. So if you are an Israeli Jewish settler, you are governed by, no matter where you are in the West Bank, you are governed by Israeli civil law. If you are a Palestinian in the West Bank, you are governed under emergency military regulations that the Israelis took from the British when the British were the colonizers, and almost word for word just reproduced them. And so the Palestinians, if they go to court, they go to a military court in the West Bank. And 99.4% of them are convicted by the military court. And very often, if they're political, and they usually are, security, quote unquote, security violations, they can't see the evidence. Their lawyer isn't given, there was secret evidence over and over and over. I mean, this is just standard, and all the lawyers know it and say so. So you have, you have this situation where there's really a complete separation in terms of the rights of people based on whether or not they're Palestinian or they're Jewish. That's the reality. I mean, that's an apartheid by definition. That's apartheid, and apartheid is under international law a crime. It's an international crime. To have a system of apartheid, and there's no question. So why did they do it? To go back to this question, why do we have such a one-sided presentation? Why do we have, the Congress, or the deplorable Congress that we do, and the things that they do and what they say? It's not about friendship. It's not about shared values. These are completely imperialist politics and imperialist policy, and humanitarian concerns or friendship or any of that. They're completely separate categories. And it's just deception when they tell us that Joe Biden, pretends to cry and, all of that kind of stuff. That's just garbage. It's just show acting, and they all know it. It's because Israel is a vital cog in the U.S. global military machine. That's the reality. It's really an extension of the U.S. Military. It's like, and they used to talk about this. They used to talk more openly about it. That it's like a giant base from the Pentagon and from the Washington's point of view. It's a giant base that can't be sunk. It's not. It's like a big aircraft carrier from their point of view. And at a time like this, at a time now when the U.S. focus is shifting, as it has since Obama announced his first year in office, the pivot to Asia, that the pivot to Asia, the main concentration of U.S. forces is in Asia now. But the Middle East is still very important. There's two aircraft carrier strike groups there right now, one in the Persian Gulf and one in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's very important. But Israel's role is also very important. And one of the things that we do in the book is to say that that if you look at the history of where Israel has intervened elsewhere in the world, they consider it a good investment. Biden, who, is supposedly this great friend, loves Israel, I'm a Zionist, all that. He said years ago, Israel, the money we send to Israel is our best investment. This is paraphrased a little bit, but not much. He said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. Well, why? Why would you have to invent it? And what's it? Because he's not talking there about sympathy for anybody. He's talking about global politics and world politics and the U.S. politics. So you have this, and And, you know, in a way, when you look at it, when you think about it, if that's really what I'm saying is true, and that it's really serves U.S. global hegemonic interest of imperialism and interest of empire, then it's not really friendship at all. It's like you're a security guard for us. You're a security guard protecting our interest in the region. And, you know, so we'll give you a lot of money to do that. You'll be a very well-paid security guard. And they are, you know, 3.8 billion. Now Biden wants to give 14 more billion, 3.5 years worth. And this is a country that has, for most people, a standard of living similar to those of Western Europe. And yet, so, you know, you have money, you have child poverty going from 5.2% to 12.4% between 21 and 22. But there's no money for kids. There's no money for children. There's no money for all the things that people need. But there's plenty of money, as much money as we can come up with for Israel and for Israel's military. So the last thing I want to say is just this, and I will stop and we can talk. So we have, the book has an updated, the new version of the book has an updated chronology. It's a highly useful chronology that goes back to the late 1800s and has a lot of detail in it. And I just want to say some of the chapters. So, Watchdog for the West is a chapter. And in addition to the thing that I said before about Chaim Weizmann in 1914, in I think 1951, Haaretz, at that time the real voice of the government, said, you know, if anybody acts discourteous to the U.S., you can count on us to keep them in line, something along those lines. Is Israel an apartheid state? The new version has a lot of update on that. The Palestinian right of return, subsidizing occupation, U.S. aid to Israel, Palestine and the U.S. anti-war movement. And it also has appendices and from Auschwitz survivor Hajo Meyer, who says, I can identify with Palestinian youth and with others. And also a great piece that came out long ago, like 1967, called Israel, Base of Western Imperialism by Abdel Wahab al-Masiri, who's late Egyptian historian of Zionism. And I'll just close by saying this, that at the end of his piece, which was a pamphlet when it came out, he recounts that Moshe Dayan in 1966, then defense minister, is in Vietnam. And he's talking to someone who's a supporter of the Labor Party in New York. And he says, why is he there? I mean, you don't have troops there, but why is Moshe Dayan in Vietnam? And he says, Israel must protect itself. Think about that one for a minute. I mean, that's like, you're part of the imperialist world. You're a part, you know, you're serving U.S. interests, and you have to show your loyalty. Thank you.
So thank you, Richard. And right now we're going to be starting the Q&A. If you have a card with comments or questions, please give it to Robin. And Robin Larson, she's going to come up now and she's going to start the process of Q&A.
Fact, Iran backs Hamas. Fact, Putin is allied with Iran. Fact, Putin is allied with Trump, anti-Biden. Fact, Troop and MAGA are anti-Jewish fascists. Question. Now, I mean, this president has quite a lot of ideas here. Fact, which side in this Israel versus Palestine situation strengthens Donald Trump? Strengthens Joe Biden?
Can I see it? Oh, there was a lot there.
There's a related question, which I
okay.
could throw in on top of this.
I don't exactly look at it that way. I mean, I don't know what and I don't think we can know what the outcome is going to be. I think Biden thought, and his advisors thought, that by going all in 100% pro-Israel, not calling for a ceasefire, refusing to call for a ceasefire, refusing to do anything really, that would wrap up the presidency for him in 2024. I think instead, it probably has, I think there's a good chance that it's cost him the presidency. And I think that that's to a large extent due to the fact that he's now alienated key parts of his electoral base. Particularly, I think Michigan is lost to him.
You might be right, but and you might be right about all of this, but if Donald Trump gets elected and if it strengthens Trump, then what difference does that make?
I mean, I'm not for Trump being reelected or elected, or for Biden being reelected. I don't think either one of them have the interests of the great majority of people in mind, or possibly can have. But what I'm saying is, we don't know what that outcome is going to be. And I mean, the list of connections, I don't get what the Putin, Iran, Hamas, why you even put that in there. Obviously, Hamas has a relationship with Iran and has received support from Iran, and that there's a loose alliance.
Okay, we have got lots and lots of questions here. So if you want to have a dialogue about him, can you do the rest of it afterward? Because a lot of what you're asking about, other people are really concerned about as well. Here's somebody saying, I'm greatly inspired by the movement for a ceasefire and for justice for Palestine. But I also see a lack of understanding of the source of the injustice and the real power behind Zionism, which I think you were actually talking about yourself. I see this as dangerous because it leaves an opening for demagogues to misdirect people. What do you think? Do you think anything short? Yeah, that's the question.
I'm not sure yet.
That was my question. So basically, that the movement, although it's very inspiring, the movement that's going on, incredibly inspiring, there's not enough exposure of the U.S. as you've done today. In general, there's not enough exposure that the U.S. is really the power behind Israel, that Israel wouldn't be able to do any of that it does if it had not been for the imperialists backing them up. And that leaves it open for people to say, oh, it's the Jews that forced the U.S. to do this, and not the other way around. Right.
Yeah. I many things maybe didn't emphasize enough, but that is absolutely true. Israel and the U.S. are very isolated in the world. You could see by the vote that took place at the United Nations in early November on Cuba, on the blockade of Cuba, the vote was 187-2. And the two were, of course, the U.S. and Israel. But the U.S. is still the dominant power in the world. And as long as that relationship exists and it supports the state of Israel, then Israel can continue to go on doing. If that were to change, and that's why what people in the U.S. do right now is important, it really is important, then Israel could not continue along its increasingly fascistic course. I mean, people are rampaging through the West Bank with weapons supported that came from the U.S. and with sometimes they're with the Israeli so-called defense forces, which are more rightly called the Israeli occupation forces, and sometimes they're not because they have their own automatic weapons. But when the troops are with them, they can do what they want. So as I said, people are being driven out of their villages. This could not be happening without that's not even discussed in the U.S. media. It's not considered worthy of discussion in most of it. They couldn't do it without the U.S.
Here's another really easy question to answer. Sorry, says she's sarcastic. Do you see anything short of the overthrow of our capitalist imperialist system that can address the injustice, inequalities, and suicidal militarism that is plaguing humanity?
Yeah, well, ultimately, no, I don't see another alternative to that. I think there has to be a new system. I think this system has had it. It can continue based on its violence, but there really needs to be a new system. And the idea that this system is eternal, you know, I think it was, and this again paraphrasing, is that Fidel Castro once said, every social system thinks itself eternal until history teaches it otherwise. And I think the same thing goes for us here, is that it's not going to change. It's not going to change. It's driven above all by two factors, by two elements. One is profit, of course, which all the corporations who tell you our first interest is in you, you know, we know they're lying because their lips are moving, as they say. They're lying, and their first concern is their profits. But the second, and more important than profit, is global domination. And from the point of view of the heights of the U.S. ruling circles, I mean, the real inner circle, you know, that's why many corporations have wanted to end the blockade of Cuba, the embargo of U.S. trade with Cuba, but the government has said, no, we're not going to do it. We know, we'll make it up to you some other way. But, you know, our interest is in destroying our enemies.
What do you think would have been an appropriate, underlined, response by Israel to the October 7th attack by Hamas?
Well, I think that what they had to do was that, again, like puts October 7th as the first day of history. It's what happened before. You can't treat people like this and think that that there's not going to be, you know, violent responses. You know, I mean, it's just not realistic to think that. You know, you can't abuse people in the kind of way that Israel has been abusing the Palestinians and think, well, they're just, you know, just stick to nonviolence. And, you know, we showed the film here the Friday night called Gaza Fights for Freedom. I don't know if people have seen Gaza Fights for Freedom. Gaza Fights for Freedom follows a 1.5-year process called the Great March of Return that started on Land Day as a Palestinian holiday, our Palestinian commemorative day, and in 2018, and it lasted more than a year. It was supposed to go for 6 weeks, and it was inside this fenced-in area, and the Israelis shot and killed, I think it was 233 Palestinians during that time, and wounded 9,000 with live ammunition, and Israel had one slightly wounded soldier in the whole time. I mean, they're sitting above a fence with sniper rifles and deciding, and the commander of the Israeli forces said, we know where every bullet landed.
Mm.
Every bullet landed. So in other words, I think that addressing how Israel should have responded after October 7th, it really begs the question. It's what they did before.
The ADL and Israel lobby groups advocate for Israel without registering as agents of a foreign nation.
They sure
What
did.
is your opinion of this situation?
Yeah. And
What
the ADL
should be done about it.
And the ADL should be called the League for the Defamation of Anybody Who Criticizes the State of Israel. They should change their name. ADL was started in 1914. It was a genuine civil rights organization at one time. It's not anymore. It's a hit team. It's a hit squad that tries to, along with Canary Mission, it's called, and some of these others, to dox people, to destroy their lives, to destroy their careers, particularly in academia, if they criticize the state of Israel. ADL, by the way, in the 1990s here, and I was one of the people who was targeted, ADL was collaborating, and this came out in court, with the South African apartheid regime and the SFPD, ADL and the Israeli government. And it became a case, and they finally, they had to admit, guilt in this, but they were collaborating together and gathering information on all kinds of organizations, liberal and radical organizations in the Bay Area. And that was that information was being transferred to apartheid South Africa in the 1980s and early 1990s, and to Israel, and to, of course, SFPD's intelligence and FBI intelligence.
Here's someone who's written 3 highly detailed historical questions. And in all fairness to everybody else who's got questions, I'm going to only read the first one. How did the Zionists in the U.S. control and restrict Jewish refugees into the U.S. during and after World War II in favor of refugee ships going to Palestine?
I think I understand the question. So there was so much anti-Semitism and virulent anti-Semitism. The Lindbergh movement, the American First movement in the 1930s, that Charles Lindbergh was the leader of, was really a fascist. He was a fascist. And that movement was very anti-Semitic. And there was a lot of, and it was encouraged, of course, by what was going on in Germany and elsewhere in Europe but the government, the Roosevelt government, and Roosevelt refused to get behind the Wagner bill. This is in the Wagner-Rogers bill. This was one to bring in 1939 to allow 20,000 Jewish children to leave Germany, occupied Europe, come to the United States. It failed. It was defeated. And it was defeated because Roosevelt wouldn't get behind it. And Roosevelt wouldn't get behind it because he thought he would lose the 1940 election to Lindbergh if he did, because there was so much anti-Semitism. And he didn't know Lindbergh was going to run, and he ended up not running. And it was Wendell Willkie, and Roosevelt won. But based on political opportunism. And then in a quote in the book, 1943, I'm forgetting who was the Secretary of Treasury at that time, but maybe somebody knows. But he wrote a report. He had a report written by the State Department accusing the U.S. government of not only not doing anything to rescue Jewish refugees and people who are now in the concentration camps, but of actually hampering those interests. When the war was over, the U.S. didn't want the Jewish survivors to come to the U.S. They thought that a lot of them were communist or socialist and dangerous. And the Zionist organizers didn't want them to come to the U.S. and Britain either. They wanted to force people. People were held in DP camps. Sometimes they were the same as the concentration camps. They were held in DP, displaced persons camps, after the war, sometimes up to 2 years. So, and the way to leave the camps became to go to Palestine and to join the Zionist movement.
So I'm going to read. I'm sorry.
I was going to suggest, Bruce and I just agreed that he would ask the questions that are coming in from the chat.
Okay.
Because there are lots of people who are watching on Zoom.
Oh, good.
Okay, so I'm going to read one of the questions from the chat here. Is there any room in the resolution of this long and painful conflict for organizations whose primary focus is promoting the grassroots understanding between individuals on both sides in this conflict as a prerequisite for peace? The Parent Circle Families Forum, which says that their mission is to, quote, to create a framework for reconciliation between the two peoples that takes into account, excuse me a second here, that takes into account that any political peace agreement must include an infrastructure for the process of reconciliation to work towards an end to violence and towards the achieving an accepted political agreement to influence the public and the political decision makers to choose reconciliation. And it goes on and on. This is in other words, I think you get the idea of that question.
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very commendable that people think, they can do this, but have the reconciliation. But the reconciliation approach, I think, mistakenly frames the whole issue. That what's really going on here is a struggle between two peoples, when fundamentally, and there may be that struggle, but fundamentally what it is it's imperialism. Israel is a part of the U.S. empire. That's the title of the book, Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. empire. It's part of the U.S. empire. It's it plays an essential role in that empire, and the form in which it presently exists means that it must do that. And the idea that somehow if people just, got together, and there have been numerous projects like this of Palestinian and Israeli children, usually it is, getting together and that kind of a role. But I think it fundamentally misrepresents the
Let me,
conflict.
there's one more question, I think, that sort of a follow-up from that one. So
I was
it's very
gonna-
short.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Is a two-state solution possible now or desirable in your view?
Well, we've been very careful. I mean, I've been involved in Palestine's solidarity activities for 50 years, actually. It was 50 years ago at the time of the 1973 war that I first got involved. And in that whole period of time, those of us who fight in solidarity with the Palestinians, I don't think are the ones to determine what the outcome is. I think that and people do express their views. I mean, it's hard to see the two-state solution when the whole of the West Bank is crisscrossed with settler-only roads and settlements. There's 700,000 settlers now in the West Bank, and a considerable number of them are fascists. They call them hilltop youth, but they're fascist, and they're growing in number. They're growing in armament and all of that. So it's hard to see how that. And I don't think any of the Israeli governments, starting with Levi Eshkol back at the time of the '67 war when he was prime minister, up until Netanyahu today, any of them really ever intended to give up the West Bank. They don't intend to give up the West Bank. And yeah, there's been a lot written about this now, about how immediately after the end of the Six-Day War, which was like June 11th or 12th, 1967, the Israeli cabinet is discussing how to keep the land but get rid of the people who are on the land.
Here's a question about money. Isn't the U.S. support of Israel, doesn't it have to do with money? The financial support for Israel. And then there's a related question by someone else about how we are giving $14 billion a year to support Israel's projects.
Yeah. Well, I don't know exactly what that means, but does it mean that money is what influences the U.S. to do what it does? I don't think so. I don't think it's the Israeli lobby. I think all of those things. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we discuss in the book and talk about is does the Israeli lobby control the U.S. foreign policy? No, it doesn't. The Israeli lobby has been emboldened and empowered because it's marching along the same path as Washington is, and the same goes for Cuba. So at a certain point, those lobbies take on a life of their own too. They can become, they've been encouraged, but I mean, it's not like there's somebody up there in Washington with the puppet master pulling all the strings and everything that happens, it was all planned. I mean, that's the conspiracy theory that's very dangerous and very, very often, almost always leads to anti-Semitism. Really, it almost always leads in that direction. Just let me say this: it's about the annual U.S. allocation, which is now virtually all military aid, is $3.8 billion a year, and that was implemented by Obama, who had his own feelings. And it's interesting. Obama had been in solidarity activities in Chicago in solidarity with the Palestinians before he was president. They hushed that up to a large degree, and then he, of course, he went, even though he didn't like Netanyahu, he is the one who implemented the $3.8 billion a year and supplemental funding. And now the $14 billion is what Biden is proposing go to Israel in addition to the $3.8 billion a year. It's by far in excess of what any other country has ever received from the U.S. in foreign aid.
You go ahead, Bruce, with your question from the Zoom guys.
All right, so there's one more question here. What could or should the role of the UN be in the current conflict in Israel-Palestine?
Well, the Security Council is obviously not going to do anything. The U.S. is the U.S. has blocked 34 resolutions over since 67, I think, critical of the state of Israel, but probably many, many more that weren't even brought to a vote because it was known that there was going to be a vote. The UN General Assembly, which in the original idea of the UN was supposed to be the main body of the United Nations, at least that's the way it was presented. The UN General Assembly is all with the Palestinians. I mean, there was just a vote. I think it was 120 to, I don't remember how many exactly, but it was a big vote calling for a ceasefire and end to the, and also for the to support the two-state solution, which has been the official policy of the U.S., Russia, China, but it's just a myth at this point, I think. So.
Why is there so little in the media about the longstanding apartheid system in Israel?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And I think it's one that it's something people can address themselves to. People should, should write letters to the editor about this, about make them short and punchy. But you could take one fact. I mean, it just shows that the Palestinians and the Israeli settlers live under separate legal systems in the same small territory. How come that's not considered apartheid? How come you don't, to the media, how come this isn't covered? But there's no question about it that it goes hand in hand with what I was saying earlier about, I believe, about the mass media here, is that the mass media, particularly in times of war and crisis, becomes the mouthpiece of the government. And it's more effective than having a state-run media, because it looks like, well, oh, look, all of them are saying, they're all on the side of Israel and they're all demonizing the Palestinians. So Israel must be good and the Palestinians must be bad because all the media says so.
Here's a question that sort of to maybe belie that a little. Is there an Israeli movement against Bibi, and who's the leader?
Yeah, there's a movement, and I've actually written about this, not in the some in the book, but more articles earlier in the year. Is that there was a big reaction to the fascists being elected and becoming key element of the government, and even the head of the so-called Minister of Justice, who came up with this plan to give make it possible really for the extreme right-wing government to stay in power forever. And hundreds of thousands of people participated. There were many demonstrations. They went on for 40 weeks or something like that. They were still going on when the war broke out now. But they had a fundamental weakness. And the fundamental weakness was they didn't incorporate the issue of justice for the Palestinians. That was, and I said at the time, I don't think they can succeed without that, and they're not going to do it. So what it became was like a family quarrel, a bitter family quarrel, but a family quarrel. And only Israelis were allowed into the discussion. I mean, a few times when people went with Palestinian flags, they had the flags torn down. They would be attacked or, pushed out of the way. So it's not possible to talk about democracy in an apartheid regime. So, they're fighting for democracy, but they say they're fighting for democracy. But if one layer of society, like in South Africa, the whites had the right to vote in South Africa. Did that make South Africa a democracy? Well, from Washington's point of view, it was fine. South Africa used to play the kind of role in Africa that Israel plays in the Middle East. And of course, it was also the source of great profit. But I think it's abominable to think that you can have democracy and have apartheid at the same time.
Do you have any more there? Well, there are more here.
Oh, okay. Oh, no, I don't have any.
Oh,
Sorry.
This is kind of an interesting one. It seems to me that the UUSF is taking an extremely Palestine position around the conflict in the Middle East. For me, as a UU member, both sides are wrong, i.e. both sides are murderers. What do you think about that?
Well, both sides are fighting. I mean, there's no question about that. But I think that fundamentally, you know, to the both sides equal sign is I don't agree with at all. The Palestinians are the indigenous population. The problem from the point of view of the Israelis and their supporters here is that the Palestinians haven't gone away. They haven't gone quietly into the night, which is what the deal was supposed to be. I mean, and that was what the hope was of the Israelis, is that they would just disappear into refugeedom. You know, it's interesting. My family were accidental Presbyterians. They just went to the nearest Protestant church when they moved to Rochester, New York. And but when I was about 9 years old, the church adopted a family, the Tanus family. One of the members here is one of the leaders now, a young leader of the movement, Nadia Tanus. But one of the kids was the same age as me, so we were friends. His name was Kareem Tanus. But what I knew of them is that I remember that they were refugees from Jordan. Well, they were refugees from Jordan because they were Palestinian. So there was, you know, for a long time, until the Palestinian movement emerged as an independent movement from the 1967 war, there was no reference to the Palestinians in the movement, in the mainstream media here. They were refugees. Refugees from where? Who knows? They were just refugees. And it was the emergence of the Palestinian movement after it was shown that the liberation of Palestine wasn't going to come about through the intervention of the Arab armies, that a Palestinian independent movement, the PLO, emerged as a radical and independent movement with multiple tendencies in it. But again, to go back to the beginning of it, the Palestinians are the victims of what's going on. They're not the aggressors, and they deserve to have the support and solidarity of people all over the world.
I just have one more question. I think that I know we're getting close to wanting to end, but I'll ask this. I think this is an interesting question maybe to end up on. Can you please talk about Hamas as a representative of the Gazan people, their social welfare role, their popularity, the massive underground system that the Israelis and U.S. powers say is military?
And then it was an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was very strong in Egypt and outlawed and still outlawed, and has branches in a number of other countries. And then when the Intifada started, or actually before the first Intifada started, and the Israelis allowed Hamas to operate much more freely than could the PFLP or the DFLP or Fatah, which were secular organizations. I mean, and by saying secular, it doesn't mean they were mostly people who might have religious convictions, but they were secular organizations. And then, but Hamas turned into a resistance organization as well, because you can't have no legitimacy in Palestine unless you're resisting. I mean, I think this is reference to the last question too. The dimensions, the magnitude of the crime against the Palestinians is impossible to overstate. It's impossible to overstate. If you're driven from your land and other people take your possessions and live in them and use them and destroy everything they don't want, and you live in tents, and that was the beginning of it, in refugee camps in the winter, dying by the thousands, and then it goes on, and even when the tents turn into to buildings, they're densely packed refugee camps with very little opportunity for people. And so, I mean, This is the crime. That was not the crime done to the Israelis in Palestine. It was the crime done to the Palestinians. I mean, I think that has to be said. And so it might be good for people to, sound even-handed about it, but even-handed does not accurately address the reality of the situation.
Thank you, Richard. And, Richard came on short notice. I want to put that out there. I really appreciate for him doing that. I just want to say before you all leave, I have a few announcements. This conversation is going to continue. On December 9, there's going to be a film showing here. It's going to be possibly it's going to be the film about Gaza again, but there's other possibilities. But I want to, invite everybody to come back here on December 9. It's going to be at noon. I believe it's a Saturday from noon to 3 o'clock. I just want to say real briefly, I think all of us have a job to do, not only to support the Palestinian people and the struggle, but also to denounce the lie that Zionism and Judaism is somehow the same. Zionism is very, very different. Zionism is a fascist, racist, political philosophy that evolved, as Richard did such a good job explaining, evolved out of the needs of imperialism and colonialism. Judaism is a 4,000-year-old religion, which has his own trajectory and so on. But the apologists for Israel and what it's doing always try to confuse those two, and I think a lot of people are confused, including a lot of Jews. But more and more Jews are realizing that Zionism is not Judaism and are denouncing Zionism. So I think we all have a responsibility to study this question and to inform the public about that, because that really it's the strongest thing that the Zionists have going for them, is to say, oh well, if you criticize us, you're criticizing the Jewish people, you're anti-Semitic and all that. So anyway, in terms of I want to thank all the people that came on Zoom and all the folks that were here today. The recording of this session will be up on YouTube soon. You can just go to UUS. If you go to YouTube, go to UUSF Media, and you'll be able to find the recording, as well as recording of other programs that we've done here. One other thing, the next forum official forum will be January 22nd. So there's going to be a bit of a hiatus here. And it will be with law professor Bill Hing of the University of San Francisco, in his new book, Humanizing Immigration, How to Transform Our Racist and Unjust System. So with that, I think that our program is ended. Oh, I do want to say, for those of you who want to celebrate this coming event coming up on Thursday, you know what holiday I'm talking about, in an appropriate way. In the morning, on Alcatraz, there is a gathering of Native Americans. You have to get there early in the morning. You have to go online to get your tickets, but it's a tremendous event. It's a very, very uplifting event. Thousands of people, especially young people, Native Americans and stuff, go out there, and anybody's welcome to go. You have to go online and get your tickets. But anyway, it's an appropriate way to celebrate what they call unthanksgiving. All right. So with that, thank you, everybody, and see you next time.